The glass slipper shattered against the stone floor, its fragments glinting like broken dreams in the moonlight. But what you're about to discover about Cinderella's true story will make you question everything you thought you knew about fairy tales. Behind the magic and romance lies a tale so dark, so twisted, that Disney would never dare tell it. The real Cinderella didn't just lose a shoe that night. She lost her soul. Most people think they know Cinderella's story. A kind girl, cruel stepfamily, magical transformation, glass slipper, happily ever after. But that sanitized Disney version is nothing more than a carefully crafted lie designed to protect you from the truth. The real story, the one the Brothers Grimm collected from German folklore, is soaked in blood and built on a foundation of mutilation and revenge. In the original tale, there were no singing mice or pumpkin carriages. Instead, there was a girl so desperate to escape her torment that she made a deal with forces beyond human comprehension. When the prince announced his ball, Cinderella's stepsisters didn't just try on the golden slipper, they butchered their own feet to make it fit. The eldest sister took a knife and sliced off her big toe, the blood pooling in the golden shoe as she gritted her teeth through the agony. "When you are queen," her mother whispered, "you won't need to walk anymore." The prince, either blind or willfully ignorant, helped her onto his horse. But the birds that had been watching from the trees began to sing a warning song. Turn and peep, there's blood within the shoe." The shoe is too small for her, the true bride waits for you. Only then did the prince notice the crimson trail dripping from the stirrup. He returned the mutilated girl and demanded to see the other sister. Without hesitation, the second stepsister grabbed the same bloody knife and carved off her heel. Again, the prince was fooled by the fit of the gore-filled slipper. Again, the birds sang their haunting warning. This wasn't a story about finding true love. It was about the lengths people will go to when desperation consumes them. The stepsisters' willingness to destroy their own bodies reveals something far more disturbing than simple vanity. They understood that in their world, a woman's worth was measured not by her character or intelligence, but by her ability to fit into the role others had designed for her, no matter how much it hurt. When Cinderella finally appeared and the slipper fit perfectly, you might think the violence was over. You'd be wrong. The Brothers Grimm weren't finished painting their portrait of revenge. During Cinderella's wedding procession, those same birds that had warned the prince descended upon the stepsisters like harbingers of divine retribution. They didn't just attack, they systematically destroyed. First, they pecked out the right eye of each stepsister. As the wedding party passed by on their return, the birds completed their work, taking the left eyes as well. The stepsisters would spend the rest of their lives in complete darkness, stumbling through a world they could no longer see, their faces forever marked by the price of their cruelty. But here's what's truly chilling about this ending. Cinderella watched it happen. She sat beside her prince as her stepsisters screamed in agony, their blood mixing with their tears as they clawed at their ruined faces. And according to the tale, she felt no horror, no pity, no human compassion. The girl who had once been gentle and kind had been transformed into something else entirely, something that could witness mutilation and call it justice. This wasn't the magic of a fairy godmother at work. This was the magic of a young woman who had been broken so completely that revenge had become her salvation. The birds weren't random forest creatures. They were extensions of Cinderella's will, carrying out the vengeance she was too pure to voice but too damaged to resist. Consider what this means. A girl so traumatized by abuse that she could orchestrate the permanent disfigurement of her tormentors and feel nothing but satisfaction. The real horror of Cinderella isn't in the blood or the violence. It's in the realization that the heroine of our beloved fairy tale had become a monster in beautiful clothing. The golden slipper wasn't just a perfect fit for her foot. It was a perfect fit for the darkness that had grown in her heart, shaped by years of cruelty into something that matched the violence of her world. What makes this blood-soaked origin even more disturbing is how it reflects the true nature of the world Cinderella inhabited. This wasn't a magical kingdom where good triumphed over evil. This was a brutal medieval society where survival meant embracing the very cruelty that had shaped you. The stepmother's coaching of her daughters reveals the systematic nature of this violence. She didn't hesitate to encourage mutilation because she understood the rules of their world. A woman's body was currency, and pain was simply the cost of doing business. "Cut off whatever doesn't fit," she instructed, as casually as if she were giving directions to the market. But the most chilling aspect of the original tale isn't the physical violence. It's the psychological transformation that made it possible. Cinderella's years of abuse had rewired her understanding of justice. She had learned that kindness was weakness, that mercy was foolishness, and that the only way to ensure your safety was to eliminate those who threatened you. When the birds destroyed her stepsister's eyes, they weren't acting on some cosmic sense of fairness. They were responding to Cinderella's deepest, darkest desires, the ones she couldn't admit even to herself. The magic in this story isn't benevolent. It's a manifestation of trauma so severe that it literally reshaped reality around her pain. This is why the Disney version had to be sanitized. The real Cinderella isn't a role model for young girls. She's a cautionary tale about how victims can become perpetrators, how survival can require sacrificing your humanity, and how happily ever after sometimes means learning to live with the monster you've become. The blood in that golden slipper wasn't just from her stepsister's mutilated feet. It was from Cinderella's own soul, which had been slowly bleeding out during all those years of abuse, leaving behind something beautiful on the surface but hollow and cold beneath. The real question isn't whether Cinderella got her happy ending, it's whether she was still human enough to deserve one. The fairy godmother didn't appear out of kindness. She appeared because Cinderella's desperation had reached a level that could literally tear holes in reality. When Disney gave us the cheerful, grandmotherly figure with her bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, they erased something far more sinister: the true nature of magical contracts and the price that must always be paid. In the original folklore, magical assistance never comes free. Spirits, witches, and otherworldly beings don't help mortals out of the goodness of their hearts. They help because they want something in return. And what they want is always more valuable than what they give. When Cinderella knelt by her mother's grave, weeping tears of blood from years of abuse, something ancient and hungry answered her call. The entity that appeared didn't look like a kindly grandmother. It manifested as something that reflected Cinderella's own fractured psyche. Beautiful on the surface, but with eyes that held the darkness of eternity. "I can give you everything you desire," it whispered, "but magic always demands payment. Are you prepared to pay the price?" Cinderella, broken and desperate, agreed without asking what that price would be. This is how magical contracts work in the real world of folklore. The victim is always too desperate to negotiate, too damaged to think clearly about consequences. The entity fed on her desperation like a parasite feeds on its host, growing stronger with every tear she shed. The transformation wasn't just physical. As the rags became silk and her dirty skin became porcelain smooth, something essential was being extracted from her soul. Her capacity for genuine emotion, her ability to form authentic connections, her very humanity. These were being slowly drained away to fuel the magic. The beautiful gown and glass slippers weren't gifts. They were a prison made of her own stolen essence. The midnight deadline wasn't arbitrary either. It represented the limited time she could maintain, this artificial persona before the magic consumed what remained of her true self. Each second that passed brought her closer to becoming nothing more than a beautiful shell, animated by otherworldly forces but empty of anything recognizably human. Part 2, 350 words. The most telling aspect of the fairy godmother's magic was its temporary nature. Real love, real transformation, real healing. These things are permanent. They grow stronger over time, not weaker. But the fairy godmother's gift had an expiration date, which reveals its true nature. It wasn't meant to save Cinderella, but to trap her. Think about what actually happened at that ball. Cinderella didn't win the prince's love through her personality, her intelligence, or her character. She won it through magical deception, an artificial beauty that masked her true, traumatized self. The prince fell in love with a lie, and Cinderella fell in love with being loved for being someone else entirely. This created a psychological dependency more powerful than any drug. For one night, Cinderella experienced what it felt like to be desired, admired, and treated with respect. But it wasn't really her receiving this treatment. It was the magical construct the entity had created using her soul as raw material. When midnight struck and the magic began to fade, Cinderella was left with a horrifying realization. Her true self would never be enough. The glass slipper wasn't left behind by accident. It was bait in a trap that required Cinderella's willing participation to close. The entity knew that once she tasted the intoxicating power of being someone else, she would do anything to reclaim that feeling. The slipper was her dealer's calling card, a reminder of what she could have again if she was willing to pay an even higher price. When the prince began his search, Cinderella waited. She could have revealed herself immediately, but she didn't. She hid in the shadows, watching other women try to claim her stolen identity, because part of her understood that stepping forward meant accepting the contract's final terms. The entity had given her a sample of its power, and now it was time to pay the full price. The fairy godmother's true evil lay not in the magic itself, but in how it made Cinderella complicit in her own destruction. She wasn't rescued by magic. She was addicted to it. The final payment came due the moment the glass slipper slid perfectly onto Cinderella's foot. But the price wasn't her firstborn child or her life. It was something far more precious and irreplaceable: her free will. From that moment forward, every choice she made would be guided by the entity's influence. Every emotion carefully calibrated to serve its purposes. The prince saw what the magic wanted him to see: a perfect bride who would never challenge him, never disagree with him, never be anything other than exactly what he needed her to be. Cinderella had become a beautiful automaton, programmed to fulfill the role of the ideal wife. Her stepfamily's abuse had broken her spirit, but the fairy godmother's magic had stolen what remained of her soul. This explains why Cinderella felt no horror when the birds attacked her stepsisters. She was no longer capable of genuine emotional responses, only the responses that served the entity's agenda. Revenge satisfied the creature that now controlled her. So revenge felt like justice to Cinderella. Compassion would have weakened its hold. So compassion became impossible for her to feel. The most disturbing aspect of this magical contract is how it perpetuated the very abuse it claimed to resolve. Cinderella's stepfamily had treated her as an object, denying her agency and humanity. The fairy godmother simply transferred ownership of that object from them to itself, using the prince as an unwitting intermediary. Cinderella went from being a slave in her stepmother's house to being a puppet in the entity's cosmic game. The real horror is that Cinderella probably never realized what had been done to her. The magical influence would have felt like her own thoughts, her own desires, her own choices. She would have believed she was finally happy, finally free, never understanding that her freedom had been the very thing sacrificed to create that illusion of happiness. The fairy godmother's greatest trick wasn't the transformation of pumpkins into carriages or mice into horses. It was convincing a broken girl that selling her soul was the same thing as saving it. And in a world that valued women only for their beauty and compliance, perhaps it was. Let's talk about the prince, because his behavior throughout this story reveals something deeply unsettling about the man Cinderella supposedly lived happily ever after with. This isn't a romantic hero, this is a character study in obsessive behavior, foot fetishism, and the kind of psychological dysfunction that would make modern psychiatrists reach for their prescription pads. First, consider the fundamental absurdity of his quest. He spent an entire evening with Cinderella, presumably talking, dancing, and connecting on some level, yet he couldn't recognize her face. He claimed to be desperately in love, but apparently he never looked above her ankles. What kind of love is based solely on the shape of someone's foot? This isn't romance. It's a pathological fixation. The prince's obsession with the glass slipper reveals a disturbing psychological profile. He wasn't searching for the woman he fell in love with. He was searching for the foot that had aroused him. Every house he visited, every woman he forced to try on the slipper, was part of an elaborate fantasy where he could relive that moment of contact between glass and flesh. The slipper wasn't a clue. It was a fetish object. Think about the power dynamics at play here. The prince could have simply announced that he was looking for the woman from the ball and asked her to come forward. Instead, he chose a method that required every eligible woman in the kingdom to submit to his intimate inspection. He created a scenario where he could legally touch and examine the feet of hundreds of women, all under the guise of finding his true love. This behavior pattern suggests something far darker than romantic devotion. The prince was using his royal authority to satisfy his sexual compulsions, and society not only allowed it but celebrated it as a quest for love. The women who participated weren't potential brides. They were unwilling participants in his fetishistic ritual. The most chilling aspect of this obsession is how it shaped the relationship with Cinderella. He didn't fall in love with her personality, her kindness, or her inner strength. He fell in love with how her foot felt inside his glass slipper, and everything else about their relationship was built on that foundation of objectification. The prince's inability to recognize Cinderella's face even after spending hours with her suggests something far more disturbing than simple forgetfulness. It indicates a form of psychological blindness that reduces women to collections of body parts rather than complete human beings. He saw her foot, her silhouette, her surface, but never actually saw her. This selective blindness becomes even more troubling when we consider how he was fooled twice by the stepsisters. Despite the blood pooling in the slipper, despite their obvious pain and deception, he was initially satisfied with the fit. This suggests that his obsession was so intense that he was willing to ignore clear signs of mutilation as long as the foot could be forced into his precious glass prison. The prince's behavior also reveals a profound lack of empathy. When he discovered the stepsisters' deception, he felt no horror at their self-inflicted wounds, no concern for their pain, no questions about why they would resort to such extreme measures. He simply discarded them and continued his search, treating the mutilation as nothing more than an inconvenience to his quest. This emotional detachment is characteristic of certain personality disorders, where others are viewed not as individuals with their own feelings and experiences, but as objects to be used or discarded based on their utility. The prince's love for Cinderella follows this same pattern. She was valuable to him only insofar as she fulfilled his specific psychological needs. The royal court's acceptance of this bizarre courtship ritual reveals how normalized this dysfunction had become. No one questioned why the prince couldn't simply describe the woman he claimed to love. No one found it strange that he needed to physically examine every woman's foot to find his supposed soulmate. The entire kingdom participated in what was essentially an elaborate sexual compulsion disguised as a romantic quest. When Cinderella finally appeared and the slipper fit, the prince's immediate acceptance reveals another disturbing aspect of his psychology. He was more interested in possessing the object of his obsession than in understanding who she actually was. He didn't ask about her background, her family, her dreams, or her experiences. The foot fit, and that was enough. The most horrifying aspect of the prince's obsession becomes clear when we examine what happened after the wedding. This wasn't a man who had found his true love. This was a collector who had finally acquired his most prized possession. Cinderella became a trophy in his cabinet, valued not for her humanity but for her ability to satisfy his psychological compulsions. The prince's behavior suggests he was incapable of seeing women as complete human beings. His fixation on Cinderella's foot was just the most obvious manifestation of a deeper pathology that reduced her to a collection of desirable attributes. Her beauty, her compliance, her tragic backstory. These all became part of the fantasy he had constructed around his glass slipper obsession. This dynamic explains why their happy ending was built on such a foundation of violence and revenge. The prince didn't object to the bird's attack on the stepsisters because he was incapable of empathy. In his mind, they had interfered with his possession of Cinderella, so their punishment was not only justified but necessary. A man capable of healthy relationships would have been horrified by such brutality. The prince saw it as cosmic justice. The glass slipper itself becomes a symbol of how the prince's love was fundamentally constrictive and artificial. Glass is beautiful but fragile, transparent but cold, perfectly formed but lifeless. Cinderella's foot fit the slipper perfectly because she had been shaped by trauma into something as fragile and hollow as the glass itself. The prince didn't love her despite her brokenness. He loved her because of it. In the end, the prince's romantic quest reveals itself as something far more sinister: the systematic hunting and capturing of a woman who had been psychologically prepared by years of abuse to accept his obsessive, objectifying form of love. He didn't rescue Cinderella from her tragic circumstances. He simply transferred her from one form of captivity to another, trading her stepfamily's cruelty for his own pathological need to possess and control. The real tragedy is that in a world that had taught Cinderella she was worthless, years of systematic abuse don't just leave scars on the body, they rewire the brain itself, creating patterns of thought and behavior that can persist long after the trauma ends. Cinderella's psychological transformation wasn't magical. It was the predictable result of a developing mind forced to adapt to an environment of constant cruelty and dehumanization. When children experience prolonged abuse, particularly at the hands of caregivers who should protect them, their brains make devastating adaptations to survive. Cinderella learned to dissociate from her physical body during beatings, to suppress her emotional responses to prevent further punishment, and to fragment her sense of self into pieces that could be hidden away when the pain became too much to bear. This explains why the fairy godmother's transformation felt so natural to her. Cinderella had already been practicing becoming someone else for years. It was her primary survival mechanism. The magical alteration of her appearance simply externalized a psychological process she had been using to endure her daily reality. She was already an expert at hiding her true self behind whatever mask would keep her safe. The ball represented the first time in years that Cinderella experienced positive attention, but her trauma-damaged psyche couldn't process it in a healthy way. Instead of feeling joy or relief, she likely experienced a desperate, addictive hunger for more validation. This wasn't happiness. It was the psychological equivalent of a starving person finally being offered food, only to discover they could never feel truly satisfied again. Her behavior during the evening reveals classic symptoms of complex trauma. She couldn't trust the prince's attention, couldn't believe it was real, couldn't stay present in the moment without part of her mind preparing for the inevitable punishment that would follow. The midnight deadline became a self-fulfilling prophecy. She fled not because she had to, but because her damaged psyche couldn't tolerate prolonged exposure to kindness. The glass slipper left behind wasn't an accident or a romantic gesture. It was a dissociative fragment, a piece of the magical persona she had inhabited, abandoned when the psychological pressure of maintaining that false self became too overwhelming. Cinderella ran because she knew on some unconscious level that she couldn't sustain the illusion of being worthy of love. The prince's search created a psychological trap that perfectly exploited Cinderella's trauma responses. As she watched other women try to claim her identity, she experienced a familiar pattern: hiding, waiting, and preparing to be invisible. But this time, invisibility wasn't protection, it was self-sabotage. Her damaged psyche was more comfortable with the familiar pain of being overlooked than with the terrifying possibility of being truly seen. When she finally revealed herself, Cinderella wasn't choosing love, she was choosing the lesser of two evils. The alternative to marrying the prince was returning to her life of abuse, and her survival-focused mind calculated that royal captivity was preferable to domestic slavery. This wasn't a fairy tale romance. It was a trauma response disguised as a happy ending. The wedding ceremony itself reveals the depth of her psychological damage. As the birds attacked her stepsisters, Cinderella felt no horror because her capacity for healthy emotional responses had been systematically destroyed. Instead, she felt something she mistook for justice, but was actually the satisfaction of seeing her abusers suffer as she had suffered. This wasn't healing. It was the perpetuation of trauma through revenge. Her transformation into royalty required her to completely suppress her authentic self in favor of becoming whatever the prince and court expected her to be. For someone who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological invisibility, this felt natural, even comfortable. She didn't have to learn how to be a princess, she just had to apply the same survival skills she had developed as an abused child. The most tragic aspect of Cinderella's psychological transformation is that she likely experienced her wedding day as the ultimate validation of her survival strategies. Her ability to endure abuse, to hide her true feelings, to become whatever others needed her to be. These trauma responses had finally paid off with the ultimate prize: escape from her tormentors and elevation to royalty. What she couldn't understand, because her development had been so severely disrupted, was that she hadn't escaped abuse. She had simply graduated to a more sophisticated form of it, one that felt like love because it came with prettier chains and more comfortable cages. The final phase of Cinderella's psychological transformation occurred after her marriage, when the full implications of her survival strategies became clear. She had spent so many years suppressing her authentic self that she no longer had access to genuine emotions, desires, or needs. The princess who emerged from the wedding ceremony was a masterpiece of adaptive camouflage, perfectly designed to please others, but completely disconnected from her own humanity. This psychological state, known in modern therapy as dissociative identity fragmentation, meant that Cinderella existed as a collection of roles and personas rather than an integrated human being. She was the perfect wife when the prince needed validation, the ideal royal when the court required representation, and the silent victim when circumstances demanded her invisibility. But beneath all these carefully constructed identities, the real Cinderella had simply disappeared. The prince's obsession with her foot becomes even more disturbing in this context. He had unknowingly selected a woman whose psychological makeup made her incapable of genuine intimacy or authentic connection. Her trauma had prepared her to be exactly what he needed: a beautiful object that could perform the role of beloved without ever challenging the fantasy with real human complexity. The bird's violence against her stepsisters served as the final proof of Cinderella's complete psychological transformation. A healthy person would have felt conflicted about such brutal revenge, grateful for justice, but horrified by the cruelty. Cinderella felt only satisfaction, because her moral compass had been so severely damaged by years of abuse that she could no longer distinguish between justice and vengeance. Her happily ever after represents the triumph of survival over healing, adaptation over recovery. She had successfully escaped her abusive environment, but only by becoming someone fundamentally incapable of experiencing genuine happiness, love, or peace. The glass slipper fit perfectly because she had been psychologically shaped by trauma into something as beautiful, fragile, and hollow as the crystal itself. Cinderella's story isn't about transformation. It's about a young woman so completely broken by abuse that she mistakes psychological numbness for happiness, and confuses successful people-pleasing with true love. Her fairy tale ending is actually a horror story in disguise. The wedding bells had barely stopped ringing when the first servant disappeared. Martha, a young maid who had dared to ask the new princess about her life before the castle, simply vanished during the night. The official explanation was that she had left to care for a sick relative, but the other servants noticed that her belongings remained untouched in her quarters, and her final week's wages sat unclaimed in the steward's office. Within 6 months of Cinderella's arrival, the castle staff had learned a new rule: never ask the princess about her past, never comment on her strangely distant demeanor, and never, under any circumstances, mention the word stepfamily. Those who violated these unspoken commandments found themselves assigned to increasingly dangerous duties: cleaning the highest towers during storms, handling the prince's hunting weapons, working alone in the castle's deepest cellars where accidents happened with disturbing frequency. The prince, meanwhile, had begun displaying behaviors that made even his most loyal guards uncomfortable. His obsession with feet had evolved into something far more comprehensive and disturbing. He commissioned dozens of glass slippers in different sizes and styles, filling an entire chamber with them. Servants reported finding him there in the early morning hours, handling the shoes with an intensity that bordered on worship, whispering to them as if they could respond. Cinderella's role in these developments was subtle but unmistakable. She never directly ordered anyone's punishment or removal, but her presence seemed to trigger a kind of psychological contagion throughout the castle. Staff members found themselves reporting on each other's conversations, competing to demonstrate their loyalty to the royal couple, and gradually adopting the same emotional numbness that characterized their new princess. The transformation wasn't limited to the servants. The prince's advisors noticed changes in his decision-making processes. He became increasingly isolated, relying only on Cinderella's counsel for important matters. But those who observed their private interactions realized that she rarely offered actual advice. Instead, she simply reflected his own thoughts back to him, carefully shaped and refined until he believed the ideas were his own. She had become the perfect psychological mirror, giving him exactly what he needed to hear while maintaining complete control over the information he received. As months turned to years, the castle developed its own twisted ecosystem of fear and complicity. The remaining servants had learned to recognize the signs that preceded another departure. A staff member, showing too much curiosity about the princess's behavior, asking too many questions about the mysterious accidents that befell their colleagues, or worse, expressing sympathy for the mutilated stepsisters who were occasionally seen begging in the village below. The prince's hunting expeditions became longer and more frequent, but he never seemed to return with game. Instead, local villagers reported strange sounds from the forest. Not the usual sounds of a royal hunt, but something else entirely. Something that made them lock their doors and keep their children inside until the royal party had passed. The few servants who accompanied these expeditions returned pale and silent, and several requested immediate transfers to distant provinces. Cinderella had begun hosting tea parties for the noble ladies of the court, but these gatherings had taken on an increasingly ritualistic quality. The conversations always centered on the same topics: the importance of obedience in marriage, the beauty of silent suffering, and the divine justice that punished those who stepped outside their proper roles. The ladies who attended these gatherings gradually began displaying the same emotional flatness that characterized their hostess, and their own households began experiencing similar patterns of servant disappearances and mysterious accidents. The most disturbing development was Cinderella's pregnancy. When she announced she was carrying the prince's heir, the entire castle held its collective breath. But something was wrong with this pregnancy. She showed no physical symptoms, no changes in appetite or behavior, no signs of the emotional complexity that typically accompanies expectant motherhood. She simply announced the news with the same detached pleasantness she used to discuss the weather, and the prince accepted it with an enthusiasm that seemed more desperate than joyful. The baby, when it arrived, was perfect in every way that mattered to the royal bloodline: healthy, legitimate, and undeniably the prince's child. But the staff who cared for the infant reported that it rarely cried, rarely demanded attention, and seemed to regard the world around it with the same unsettling detachment that characterized its mother. 10 years after her fairy tale wedding, Princess Cinderella had become the most feared woman in the kingdom, though few dared to speak this fear aloud. Her influence had spread far beyond the castle walls, creating a network of noble families who had learned to mirror her psychological patterns as a survival strategy. The kingdom's upper classes had become a collection of beautiful, empty shells, all performing their roles with the same mechanical perfection that had once saved Cinderella's life. The prince himself had become little more than an extension of his wife's will. His early obsessions had evolved into complete psychological dependency. He could no longer make decisions without her guidance, could no longer feel emotions that hadn't been carefully shaped by her influence. He aged rapidly under the strain of this symbiotic relationship, while she remained strangely untouched by time, as if her emotional numbness had somehow preserved her physical form. Their children, for there had been several over the years, grew up in an environment where love was performance. Emotions were dangerous, and survival required the complete suppression of authentic human responses. They learned to communicate through subtle manipulations and careful observations, developing the same predatory instincts that had allowed their mother to navigate her abusive childhood. The royal nursery became a training ground for future psychological predators. The kingdom's transformation was complete when Cinderella's stepfamily died, not from old age or illness, but from a mysterious plague that affected only them. The blind stepsisters and their mother were found in their hovel, their bodies unmarked but their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but those who prepared the bodies reported that they seemed to have died of fear itself. On the day of their funeral, Cinderella appeared at the graveside for the first time since her wedding. She stood perfectly still as the crude coffins were lowered into the ground, and witnesses swore they saw her lips move in what might have been prayer or might have been something else entirely. As she turned to leave, one observer noticed that she was wearing glass slippers, the same ones from her transformation night, somehow unbroken despite the years that had passed. The cycle was complete. The abused had become the abuser, the victim had become the predator, and the fairy tale had revealed its true nature as a horror story where the monster wears a crown and lives happily ever after in a castle built on the bones of those who dared to question her perfect, empty smile. So there you have it, the real story of Cinderella stripped of its Disney magic and romantic delusions. What we've uncovered isn't a tale of triumph over adversity, but a psychological horror story about how trauma perpetuates itself across generations, how victims can become predators, and how society often mistakes the absence of authentic emotion for the presence of perfect virtue. The glass slipper was never about finding true love. It was about finding the perfect victim, someone so psychologically damaged that they could mistake obsession for devotion, control for care, and emotional death for happily ever after. Cinderella didn't escape her abusive environment. She simply learned to weaponize the survival skills it had forced her to develop. This is why the original fairy tales were so dark, so violent, so psychologically complex. They weren't meant to give children false hope about magical rescue. They were warnings about the real monsters that live among us. The ones who smile beautifully while they destroy everything they touch. The ones who have learned to turn their own trauma into a tool for creating more trauma in others. The next time someone tells you about their own fairy tale ending, look a little closer. Check for the emotional numbness behind the perfect smile, the psychological manipulation disguised as romantic gesture, the missing servants who ask too many questions. Because in the real world, happy endings are earned through healing, not achieved through revenge. And true love requires the courage to be authentically human. Something Cinderella lost long before she ever found her glass slipper. What other childhood fairy tales do you think hide similar dark truths beneath their sanitized surfaces? Snow White's mysterious coma? Sleeping Beauty's century-long unconsciousness? The psychological implications of Beauty and the Beast? If this deep dive into Cinderella's hidden darkness opened your eyes to the disturbing realities lurking behind our most beloved stories, then you need to subscribe to Sinister Stories right now. We're dedicated to peeling back the pretty facades of fairy tales, myths, and legends to reveal the psychological horrors, cultural warnings, and uncomfortable truths that have been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because next week we're exploring the cannibalistic undertones of Hansel and Gretel. And trust me, you'll never look at gingerbread houses the same way again. Share this video with someone who thinks they know their fairy tales. And let us know in the comments which story you want us to dissect next. Welcome to Sinister Stories, where happily ever after is just the beginning of the real nightmare.